G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going through my team selection for the Las Vegas Grand Prix, the third last race on the calendar for 2025. So if you're new around here, there probably aren't many of you nowadays, or you're just enjoying the content. As always, please do drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. So, as always with these videos, we'll go through how the team did in the most recent race week and then evaluate some of the key considerations for the upcoming deadline. There will be no final thoughts video ahead of Las Vegas, but there will be a deadline stream. So, just keep that in mind on the content schedule for this channel heading into the next week or so before we get to Las Vegas. Brazil. 295 points on a sprint race weekend. Not the best, not the worst. A very minor red arrow down to 1.6k overall from 1.2, and it pretty much started and finished with Gabriel Bortoleto. We'll get to him in just a minute, but otherwise across the board, pretty good results from most of the assets in the team. I brought in Lando Norris, George Russell and Mercedes for Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc and Ferrari. Ferrari just did not look with it at all in the build-up to the deadline, both in free practice 1 and sprint qualifying. And I did think McLaren, on balance, had much better pace than the Red Bull. Max was struggling pretty much through free practice. We saw him obviously not just look, or he just looked very out of sorts as well, pretty much across the entire weekend until we got to the Grand Prix on the Sunday, which we'll talk about as well. He qualified outside the top 15 on Saturday for Grand Prix qualifying, and I think there are a myriad of factors that pushed me in the direction of Lando Norris, who has been looking quite consistent lately. His race weekend in Mexico backed up with another victory in Brazil as well. He came away with 49 points, 98 on the 2X, and I brought in George Russell for that consistency. He won in Brazil a couple years ago. And Mercedes, I think, looked the most compelling of the three remaining constructors outside of McLaren. Happy with those decisions. But funnily enough, if we just quickly jump over to F1 Fantasy Tools on the team analyzer, which I'll bring up in just a second, you can see here, if we quickly go down to the transfer impact, 22 points, but obviously going away from Max Verstappen as the 2X netted a, let's call it 8-point difference. So pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And we know how good Max Verstappen did. He started from the pit lane, finished P3, could have been P2 if he didn't pit for tyres in the closing stages of the race. So a pretty remarkable drive from Max. Again, look, I'm not going to get too upset about that, to be honest. I was pretty happy with the decision making up to that point. I definitely didn't expect Max to drive all the way into P3. But I think all in all, a pretty decent outing for my team, backed up by 15 points from Carlos Sainz, 21 from Pierre Gasly, who has had a great result, great history around Interlagos, and at his price, delivering that kind of production, pretty impressive stuff. He got a 0.6 rise for his troubles. So very happy with that. 63 from McLaren, should have been higher on a sprint race weekend given the caliber of both drivers and the car, but Oscar Piastri's DNF in the sprint obviously paid to anything more than that 63. And then 91 for Mercedes, that Kimi Antonelli P2 in the sprint and the race, and then George Russell again just being there and thereabouts in the top 5 did wonders for the constructors. So 295 points, not a great weekend given the rank drop, and I'm expecting that to drop a little bit more with the 3X for users in Qatar that haven't yet activated that chip. But all things considered, a solid weekend. I'd love a green arrow in Vegas to kind of push me closer to 1K, because I think the 1K dream is probably out of reach given I've used all chips bar autopilot. But we can hope and pray at this point. So we'll go into some weekend notes, but all in all, a solid but not spectacular weekend in Brazil. So Max Verstappen, the man is on a different planet. He is a generational driver. I'm just shocked, speechless. I clearly don't have words to describe the level of performance and production, not just in F1 Fantasy, but in F1 generally, that he is able to deliver. That pit lane start to P3, I would say even better than his drive last year in the wet, although in treacherous conditions to win the race, again, another remarkable drive. Him at Brazil reminds me of Lewis Hamilton up until a couple of years ago at Brazil. Just incredible drives non-stop. And Max is proving time and time again that he is a force to be reckoned with regardless of the track and the conditions. In F1 Fantasy, he was the top scoring driver for the weekend, and I definitely wouldn't have expected that kind of production from someone like Lando Norris, who starts, finishes P1. You're only going to get that kind of point ceiling from a driver that has a bunch of overtakes and positions to gain. And Max delivered exactly that. I think, again, as I pointed out on Twitter, if you follow me there, the highest score, he had 63 in Brazil. The highest score since then was, surprise, surprise, Max Verstappen with 77 in Brazil last year. And, the driver of the day, 13 overtakes, 16 positions gained, finished P3, would have been higher if he passed Antonelli, or he actually just didn't pit for tyres at the end there. So he's an incredible beast. And on his day, I think is the man to beat. I think in Vegas, he's going to be seriously a consideration for many of our teams. We know how good they are in the straight line, and he's had those recent wins at Monza, Azerbaijan. I think it's going to be a similar story in Las Vegas. On the topic of Red Bull, the pit stop points is what's keeping them relevant in F1 Fantasy. Now, I don't think suddenly that they are a clear-cut second best constructor to pair with McLaren. It is hard to say every week which is the best team. And look, McLaren aren't even delivering. It feels hard to deviate away from them at the moment, but on their day, they're going to produce 80 plus point performances. We saw that in Mexico. We saw a decent result in Singapore, and then preceding that, Monza 97, Hungary 100, Belgium 93. So we know what they're capable of. It's just a matter of avoiding DNFs, and they've pretty much had a hard time doing that in Brazil, in Circuit of the Americas, in Azerbaijan. So Red Bull, I think, when Tsunoda delivers, is top 10. They're on for 60, 70, 80 points most race weekends. But Tsunoda didn't actually feature all that much at all across the weekend. He had a pretty ratchet performance, more or less. It was their fast pit stops, 25 points for Red Bull. Their fast pit stop of 1.95 seconds fetched them 20 points. And then the overall fastest pit stop only got them 5 points. That's the second time in the last 3 race weekends Red Bull have had 25 points or more from fast pit stop points. I don't think that's going to be a regular occurrence, but it is, I think, a sign that they are definitely performing in the pits. They didn't really have this in the early stages of the season, and I think something just to consider. If that's doing enough to push them ahead of the Ferraris, the Mercedes, even if Tsunoda's not performing and Max is winning races or getting close to winning races, that might be enough. So keep an eye on them in practice. Tsunoda doesn't have to set the world on fire. He just doesn't have to DNF. And you might well find Red Bull are the next popular constructor after McLaren for engaged managers. Overtakes, something also to think about, and not think about, but something to flag. Overtakes were adjusted from the Brazilian Grand Prix 6 days after the conclusion of the race weekend. Now, if you follow F1 Fantasy Tools on Twitter, they've done some great investigative digging to figure out what essentially went down after the team lock deadline, or the teams unlocked after the Grand Prix. And I'll bring up on screen a recent tweet that they shared. The developers adjusted points, and then the rankings as a result changed because overtakes were incorrectly calculated in the Grand Prix. Behrman went from 18 to 12, Tsunoda 13 to 5, Verstappen went up, and so on and so forth, as you can see here on screen. F1 put out an announcement to correct the overtakes, and any people that made transfers prior to that overtake adjustment had those transfers reversed. Value changes, obviously, as a result, were also affected. Lawson went from, I think it was a 0.6 rise to a 0.6 drop, and a number of other, points and ranks were affected as a result. So I'm not going to harp on about this too much. It's been a couple of times now, if we click into the embedded tweet, that it's not the first time it's happened. It happened in Silverstone this year and Mexico last year, as F1 Fantasy Tools have pointed out. So a little bit of a concern. I'm sure the devs will get on top of this, fix their algorithm and how overtakes are calculated. But I guess because we don't know how they calculate it and determine what constitutes an overtake, makes it a little worrying that this may well happen again. But anyway, for those of you that are wondering or had, some understanding of the situation, it seems like they've been fixed now. Prices are adjusted, ranks are fixed, and we move on to the next race weekend. And speaking of that, moving towards Las Vegas, it's a high overtake track. It's a high powered track, lots of straights, lots of overtaking zones. And as we've seen in the last couple of years, overtakes are plentiful. Who do we keep an eye on for this weekend? Now, we're going to talk about a couple of drivers in just a second, some that I think are worth considering, others perhaps not. But I do think this is, again, another argument in favor of prioritizing points and not necessarily budget building. We are 3 races away from the end of the season. Yes, I know some teams still need to use a 3X chip and may be short on budget to get to their ideal 2 premium driver lineup to use that chip. But for those of you that have used the 3X, myself included, I think there is probably an argument to make that we should just be prioritizing points. And that's going to be my super laser focused approach heading into free practice. We've got 3 sessions, so a pretty good yardstick to determine which teams and drivers look most comfortable on track this weekend. So there are a couple of drivers, the Racing Bulls, the Haas drivers, maybe even, and I hate to say it, but maybe even an Aston Martin driver as well, even though they seem to be better in the slower speed corners. Now, a couple of drivers that are front and center of mind at the moment. First of all, Oliver Bearman. Let's talk about him because he has been on an absolute flyer lately. 30, 36, and 14 in his last 3 races. He's at 8.9. And even though he is one of the highest owned assets in the game, at 27.8% owned by the top 500, still somewhat of a differential, maybe not quite as much as the other man on screen, Isaac Hadjar, but I do think Oliver Bearman is very much underappreciated. His price, yes, it's one of the most expensive in the B tier asset class beyond the likes of Alex Albon, Yuki Tsunoda, etc. But I think you're getting serious fantasy production from him. He leads the grid in overtakes and positions gained this season and is delivering almost 10 points per race. So great points per million as a result, great value for money. The one concern I will say, and I think he's very much worth a transfer in this weekend because he also has an exceptionally low threshold for a 0.6 price rise, even though that's not my priority this week, is that he is in a Haas. Now, we know that their race pace typically has been good this season, but they did say after the Brazilian Grand Prix that they are not expected to be quite as competitive. It's a high overtake track. If Bearman qualifies, bottom 3, bottom 4, I think he's perfectly a good option. But if he delivers another Q3 appearance, which we obviously can't predict, but going off free practice, we should have a good gauge. I'm not so sure he's the man for me, especially at his price. But there are ways to accommodate him. Now, speaking of a driver that does have a good qualifying record, Isaac Hadjar, he has, I think, 13 out of 21 Q3 appearances, if my memory serves me right this season. So an impeccable result, impeccable performance in that department. The Racing Bulls, although they did look quite competitive in the first 2/3 of the season, maybe have slowed down just a little bit now that the upgrades are no longer really rolled out by any team with the exception of Haas and their Coda package. Now, Hadjar also very highly engaged, 55% from the entire player base, but 19% from the engaged managers in the top 500. Concerningly, that 4.6 I don't think is truly representative of his kind of production. We know how good he is on his day. He's definitely probably, I would say one of the best candidates in the midfield in terms of what you're going to get, what you know you're going to get, if that makes sense. And I don't think, again, his overtakes and positions gained are a fair representation of that. He's a driver that qualifies quite high, can hold position, can deliver a points finish most of the time. So I think those are good omens. But again, it's a high overtake track. I wouldn't really put too much weight into a driver that qualifies between P8 and P16. We know the Alpines are going to be at the back, and I think the midfield in general is going to be a bit of a mixed bag. So 13 points in Brazil, but 1 point over the preceding 2 races net is not all that impressive. I do think, though, the Racing Bulls outfit, aside from maybe Bearman and Ocon, although, again, we know Haas from what they've been saying, it may not be as competitive, feels to me like the midfield driver pool could be a bit of a mixed bag. Maybe Williams could be an option there, but, again, it's a bit of a crapshoot. Use your gut based on FP times, and I think that's probably going to be our best yardstick for pure points. If you're still building budget, then the budget builder on F1 Fantasy Tools will serve you well. Over to the asset tier ranking. And again, talked about Max, talked about Lando. I think the top drivers in the A tier are pretty self-explanatory for how I've ordered them. Oscar Piastri is an interesting one. Now, he's really struggling, as we all know. I think the driver's title is slowly slipping away from him, and that's a discussion for another time. However, McLaren, albeit they may not be quite as strong at Vegas because these straight line, high-powered tracks seem to be where Red Bull thrive, I think Piastri is a great differential, not simply just because of the fact that his inconsistencies seem to drive away a pretty significant portion of the engaged player base, but McLaren are expected to perform very well at Qatar. It's a high to medium speed circuit, lots of high-speed corners, which seem to favor the McLaren, and I think that's where we could see Oscar's last roll of the dice there. I also think Abu Dhabi could work in favor of their car as well. It's kind of a more balanced circuit, unlike the likes of Vegas, for example, which seems to be more Red Bull heavy. So I'm going to try and position my team for potentially a Piastri move one race after Las Vegas. Constructors we've already talked about, but I think, again, Mercedes, I much prefer the consistency of them. But Red Bull, it's hard to predict pit stops. They could be good one week. They may not be quite as good the next. So keep an eye on the tyre strategy for Las Vegas, because the more pit stops teams make, the more likely they have a chance of delivering these fast pit stops. And Vegas in the past has been a 2 pit stop race. But again, we've seen this year 2 pit stop races can quickly become 1 because of the tyres. Into the B tier, Behrman, great, big fan. Gasly, great, big fan. Sainz, I think, and Albon, although Albon's 10th in my tier ranking this week. Probably the dark horses. I think Williams are going to do quite well here. I'm confident that it's, of the midfield teams, there's no one else that's really standing out to me that's going to suddenly be 5th best. So keep an eye on the Sims. Williams have kind of been about 5th for the most part this season. And I do think that consistency of the drivers, Albon across the season and Sainz in the second half of the season, certainly shone through. Kimi Antonelli, another interesting one. I think he is my pick of the bunch by a long shot for anyone that has lower budgets, especially those kind of below 125 million. If you're going for a premium driver such as Norris or Piastri, then Kimi Antonelli is top of my shopping list. Great 40-point result also in Brazil. And I think, again, he's got that, let's call it, positive omen about these non-European races. So we got Vegas here, and then we've got 2 Middle Eastern races right after. So Kimi Antonelli, my money's on him for a strong end to the season. The Racing Bulls duo we've referred to already. And I think Alonso at 4.9 million, only going to go down 0.4 this week, not the 0.6 as typical, because he's only 0.4 million above the $4.5 million price floor. If you're willing to take a punt, I don't mind Fernando Alonso at all. Early team thoughts. And I think you're looking at this screen and you're going, everyone's at risk. Well, of course everyone's at risk. We're 3 races out from the end of the season. You got to take a few punts. You got to have a bit of fun with your team. And I'm very willing to do that. So I think with the exception of Gasly, because he is one of the lowest owned drivers in the game, and McLaren, unless we see them fall off a cliff, which I just don't see happening between now and the end of the year, are probably the only 2 holds for me at the moment. I've only got 2 transfers, so I have to be a little frugal with how I use them. But I do think there's probably a guarantee, a pretty high percentage that these 2 assets stay in my team. For the rest of the team, it's fair game. So let's take a look at what we could do heading into Las Vegas. First of all, Lando Norris, George Russell, the 2 major swaps along with Mercedes in Brazil. Now, there's a lot of chatter around Red Bull being strong in Las Vegas, as I've also alluded to Max's victories at these high-powered circuits in recent memory, Azerbaijan, Monza, etc., and then obviously another great result in the Circuit of the Americas. So I think, unless I was, let's say, for argument's sake, let's say McLaren kind of surprised me a little bit, and I think perhaps Lando and George I can stick with. We know Mercedes had a 1-2 here last year in those cooler conditions. So if I want to mix up the midfield in my team, I could do a Behrman and Hadjar in 2 moves. I already talked about both, but I think Behrman, even if Haas are not meant to be that good, I would probably expect like a Q1 exit from Behrman. So plenty of upside to gain positions and make overtakes, even if it is 10 to 12 points. Just needs to avoid a DNF, and even if he did, the likelihood of him going anything up by 0.6 is quite low. So I think he's in the box seat, just looking at the budget builder, negative 34 points for a 0.6 price rise. So look, there's a silver lining to every DNF, and in Behrman's case, that's probably that this weekend. Hadjar, I mean, if I don't want to go down the Hadjar route, I could go Lawson, I could go Fernando Alonso. If you've got lower budgets than me, I'm at 138. Then you could certainly drop down a little further down. Hulkenberg, I'm not so sure. He's looked pretty mid since he had that podium in Silverstone. Bortoleto has had his measure for the second half of the season. So I'm inclined to go a Racing Bulls driver, whether that's Lawson or Hadjar, I don't know, but I could mix and match depending on how I feel if I decide to stick with Norris and Russell. Now, if I plug Bortoleto and Sainz back into the team and I want to be a bit more aggressive with my moves, then I could potentially consider the Max Verstappen transfer. Now, that would leave me 3 million. And I did talk about Oscar Piastri potentially being an option in Qatar because of those medium to high speed corners that should suit the McLaren. That would give me 3 million. Now I could do that in Qatar, but leaving 0.8, which I think would be fine because Piastri can only go down 0.3 and George Russell, can only go up or change in price 0.3. Means even if there was a $0.6 million swing one way or another, I could still afford it by 0.2, quick math. But I'm willing to potentially hold and then move out Gabriel Bortoleto. Now, Esteban Ocon potentially could be an option for me here this weekend, but having 3 transfers in Qatar would be very, very appealing, and I'm very much considering that for my team. In just having 3 on the sprint gives you a bit of flexibility to be a bit aggressive. Even 2 transfers is fine, but potentially could hold Bortoleto. I'm just not sure yet. Let's see what practice looks like. Otherwise, there is the possibility of Fernando Alonso, and then having again that kind of flexibility to pivot into Piastri. Ferrari, I'm not really so sure on at the moment. There's not a lot of moves I feel that inclined to make at the moment. So if I had Russell here, that would leave me 32. I could get to any constructor I really wanted, but I just don't see myself going Ferrari based on how inconsistent they've been. So potentially Red Bull, but again, I'd need to see a lot from Tsunoda to go down that. That's also a -10, so I'm not super excited about doing that. So I think, realistically, my 2x options this week are going to be Verstappen or Norris. But at this point, again, a lot of it's going to pretty much hinge on free practice times. I think Bortoleto for me just feels like a transfer I want to make. I've had him for several races this season. He has delivered, but I don't know, maybe his confidence is not as knocked as I think it is. I just don't know what to expect from the midfielders I've talked about. It could be anyone that thrives, and I'm happy to hold Gasly, happy to hold Sainz. So I think Bortoleto could be that aggressive transfer. Now, if I want to go anti-McLaren, I'm really not sure I will, just to be honest. You could do something like this, right? 8.4, and that would get me, I think I'm just a bit short for Kimi, right? Again, this is again 3 transfers, so -10. I'm not sure I will. I could also do Alex Albon, which I actually don't mind. If we look at Albon's recent performances, he just consistently delivers in F1 fantasy at the moment. 19 points in Brazil, 13-20. He's had 1 double-digit score in the last, 10 races? Impeccable consistency from a driver at his price. So, again, if you've got the transfers to have fun with it, then I'd absolutely consider it. But I think going against McLaren, especially that knowing that I will want them in Qatar, just feels like an arbitrary transfer for my team. So again, I've got the bandwidth, the budget flexibility to pivot into a bunch of different assets, but I like Behrman, I like Ocon, I like Albon and the Racing Bulls at the moment. But who knows? We could see a Lance Stroll P1 in free practice in Brazil, in Las Vegas. So that's probably where my head's at. Either this or keep the Norris, then swap out Sainz and Bortoleto for Behrman and Hadjar. But yeah, plenty to consider heading into the deadline. We'll obviously have a deadline stream. I know it's going to be a bit late for European viewers, so I may well adjust the time. I might even do an FP3 watch along, 30 minutes before free practice 3, then do the hour of free practice 3, and then do the 30 minutes after, just to accommodate our European viewers. But keep an eye on my Twitter page for details of that. But yeah, no final thoughts this week. A bit going on and trying to fit in as much as possible before the deadline. I'll also have my F1 article on F1.com out, my strategist selection article, so keep an eye on that for the 5 drivers and 2 constructors I would be considering for this weekend, guys. But I'm going to leave it there for now. As always, appreciate the love and support. If you can throw a like the video's way, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It definitely goes a long way with helping me build this channel up heading into 2026. So I'm going to park the bus on this video for now. As always, please do show the channel some love. I will see you on the deadline stream. But in the meantime, have a great rest of the day, and I will see you all very soon.